All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, for this Žofín after-lunch conversation. The title is The Global Challenge of China. It's my pleasure to have here Theresa Fallon, Director of Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Belgium, and Lobsang Sangay, President of the Central Tibetan Administration, Tibet, India. We have half an hour. We will try to do it live and fast. And of course, there's going to be a chance for you to ask questions and for the two guests to react. I, of course, encourage you, both of you, to react on each other, it has some speed. Maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there was some kind of a dream. One may say it was wishful thinking, that once China is going to be getting richer, so once China is going to be getting more capitalism introduced, once there is going to be a middle class, then it's going to be going also to not only through the opening of the economy, but also opening of the politics, and there is going to be a certain wave of liberalism in China, and China will go in the direction of what we can see in Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, in the, let's say, Asian type of democracy of the rich countries. We don't see it that much now. Can we expect it to happen, or what is the future of China? Where do we go now? How would you say where we are and where we are going to be in 10 years in terms of democracy and China?
That was an excellent way to put it, wishful thinking. There's been a seismic shift in perceptions on how the US as well as Europe has perceived China. And as you said, once they joined the WTO, once they became more of an economic power, there would be a growing middle class and everyone would embrace them and they would become like a liberal democracy. But that hasn't happened. And I think with the Trump administration, it's clear that there's a reevaluation of the approach. We've seen with the national security strategy that China is considered a competitor now, and they can still cooperate with them, but they're clearly a competitor, and they're in the same basket as Russia. And the Europeans as well are pushing back a bit. They're disappointed. The scales seem to have fallen from their eyes, and Germany's kind of leading on this in regard to economic issues, because they see China, with the Made in China 2025 program, China's trying to buy technology in Europe that they can't get in the US because of CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, has strengthened or tightened the ability for China to buy high tech in the US. So naturally, China turns to Europe. Europe is getting concerned because they're snapping up companies, and Europe is very open. They're very proud of that. They're open markets, but at the same time, they accuse China that they think that they're naive and that they demand reciprocity. They want to be able to invest.
And what about the internal dynamics in China?
Well, actually, sadly, under Xi Jinping, I was just reading some translations from their kind of Twitter, and they're talking about, instead of the state-owned enterprises decreasing, under Xi Jinping, they're actually growing. And I think the young people in China are getting frustrated because, you know, this is a part of the world that knows how things work when you have a state-owned enterprise, and it's really no longer, you know, China's going to be like the rest of the world. It's really a clash of two systems, and we're seeing kind of a Leninist system versus kind of the liberal democracies in the world.
Lobsang, your comments.
Yeah, just commenting on your first question. At least 30 years ago, there was a pretense, or hopefully a dream, of China becoming democracy, because then the greatest leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, said so. Tu Rongji, then Prime Minister, later Wen Jiabao, said so, that democracy is inevitable in China. But under Xi Jinping, he made it very clear, after the 19-party Congress, Xi Jinping thought is here, which is socialism with Chinese characteristic, which means no democracy, no human rights, no freedom of speech. So now the choice before us is, China is coming. Either the world transform China to be like us, a liberal democracy, or China will transform you. And One Belt, One Road is one way through which they are coming, even to Europe. Now, that's the challenge. So we have no choice. Either you transform China, or China will transform you. So President Trump is quite strong on trade war, but Vice President Mike Pence has made it very clear as far as China is concerned. So it's being the strongest as far as American government is concerned. Now the choice is before the European Union also to ally with America to try to transform or check on China, or let China take apart Europe.
And how would you say or describe the situation from within China? From within, what are the, if we can say so, the feelings of people, or if you can compare it on the number of strikes, labor strikes in the past and now? What is the turmoil inside? Or is the regime succeeding not only in consolidating more power over the economy, but also over the society? Or can we expect some kind of boiling point? What is there? What's going on under the surface?
The censorship on freedom of speech, control over the Chinese population, the grid system, the technology that they have developed to control information, propaganda, all these are pretty clear. So if you look at the past 10 years, I think as far as freedom of speech and rights are concerned, it's regressing. In the case of Tibet, 152 Tibetans have committed self-immolation. Now in case of Xinjiang, around 10% of the population, a million, are sent to, quote-unquote, labor camp, education through labor. So all this also show that China is insecure. On the one hand, China looks very powerful. On the other hand, China is most vulnerable now because the millions of people who are moving from rural areas to urban areas are looking for jobs. And the urban graduates, high school and college grads, are also looking for employment. But the salary, the wages have increased, expectations have increased, and the Chinese government has to provide employment for these people, right? Hence, through One Belt, One Road, they are trying to gain the European market so that they can employ Chinese population, which is the big challenge.
And how much the trade war, or the Trump's trade war, or US trade war, plays into the domestic situation in China? Into the consolidation of the regime, some more support of the regime, or more, let's say, questioning if the regime is right? What is the answer, or what is the reaction of the people?
It all depends on the ultimate result. If whoever submits first, whether Xi Jinping wins or not, is to be seen. So at the moment, the trade tariff is on $200 billion of Chinese goods. But American government can go up to $500 billion, but Chinese government cannot go more than $200 billion. That's all they buy from America. And if tariffs are imposed, then how does it pan out ultimately? Because already, I think, there are intellectuals and business people and Chinese population are questioning the leadership of Xi Jinping, whether coming out and declaring China to be, or claiming of #1, is right or not. Because Deng Xiaoping had clearly advised, keep low profile, do all the things you have to do. But Xi Jinping said, no, we are not going to keep low profile. We are going to declare ourselves as the next superpower. Hence, there's a tussle, or the challenge is happening. So a lot of people are questioning the leadership or the strategy of Xi Jinping. Now, the ultimate result will, decide whether Xi Jinping prevails or not.
Yeah.
And now Xi Jinping, after the Party Congress, where he changed the constitution so he can stay in power till the end of his life, isn't a sign of strength. It's actually one of fragility because he can't retire. Now we saw, just all of you probably saw on the news, the recent headline of the head of Interpol was just seized inside China, and the French police said, what's going on? And his wife got an emoji with a knife. And that's the last thing she ever heard from him. So everyone was concerned when he's high up in the Chinese Politburo. He didn't get where he is because he's not a nice guy. He's got sharp shoulders, but sharp elbows. But the idea that we would integrate China into the international system by putting a Chinese ahead of Interpol, and now we see him just disappear into China. And just a few weeks ago, it was Fan Bingbing, China's most famous movie star. She disappeared for months, and now she just resurfaced and said she's so sorry, and she owes all her career to the Chinese people, and she will pay all this tax. So I think the sign of Xi Jinping becoming the emperor of everything is a sign of fragility, but it also makes it difficult in an economic downturn, which we see. I mean, the Chinese keep pumping up really big figures. Their economy was slowing down even before this tariff war. The tariff war will accelerate it, but we're also going to see a delinkage. Economists talked about Chimerica, China and America. Their economies were so tightly interlinked that they couldn't possibly go to war. But we're seeing a delinkage, and this means that, that it will be easier. And I think the Trump administration has said no more, and he's really playing it very tough.
What has changed in Europe, thinking about China? Because it was already President Obama who had his pivot to Asia. Already on the US radar screen, the fact that the main competitor is not Russia, it is China, it has been there for some time. In Europe, first Russia is closer, but then it has not been that much and that openly discussed. Where do we stand? What is changing?
For the Europeans, China is always perceived as far away, but we've seen that perception change as China moves closer and closer into the neighborhood. Right here, we have the 16+1, so we see Chinese activity. Even Milos Zeman has talked about an aircraft carrier. That's what the Czech Republic is. So they see, this area where Russia and Europe meet. It's an area where China is carving out a lot of influence, and this is something that Brussels is very concerned about.
You mean that Brussels is concerned about Chinese influence in Central Eastern Europe?
Yes, definitely.
Yes? Oh.
And definitely. And so also the Belt and Road Initiative was not embraced by the Europeans. And so we've seen what we would characterize as a pushback, but it's in a very polite European way. It was issued on September 19th. It took several months to write because so many agencies, so many countries didn't want things put in. So it's a very watered down 14-page document. It's called a strategy, but it's pretty much like a report. And it says we want to come up with a way to, they don't say China at all, but it is definitely about China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it's their answer saying we want to protect our norms and values because China's Belt and Road Initiative is a way to change norms and values. And we've already seen with the World Bank, for example, there's been pressure for them to make it easier to make loans because of China's ability, not through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, otherwise known as the AIIB, but through their Chinese Exim Bank. They have huge amounts of money to invest, and so with no strings attached, World Bank, ADB, the Asian Development Bank, they all want to stay in the game. So there has already been a downward pressure. So we've seen changes already in norms, and the three reasons that the Europeans wouldn't sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative at BARF, the Belt and Road Forum held in Beijing, was a level playing field, lack of transparency, and a lack of protecting norms.
Clear, but in terms of the investment as such, not that much has happened. By the way, we have also advisor to our president who has disappeared in China, and the Chinese invested into a soccer club here, but it's not, in terms of seriousness of Chinese investment, we haven't seen that much in the Central Eastern Europe yet. There was something in Greece, but...
It's a clever way of doing things. We call it promise fatigue. Yep. So you kind of say, pick me, all the 16+1s were like, pick me, and then the Chinese wanted to see what they could leverage, and now they're kind of, these countries are tired, and they're like, well, we know it's not going to happen. So China has, kind of worn out their welcome with the promise fatigue.
Yeah, I might...
How do you see Europe, yeah?
I might differ a little bit, because you see the countries like Greece and Portugal more in line with the Chinese way of thinking. And recently, Italy also signed a major trade agreement, even though they just elected a very populist government. Similarly, countries like Norway and Denmark, they're normally very strong on human rights. And I've traveled to various capitals, but now their belief and advocacy and support of human rights and democracy has diminished to some extent and diluted, mainly regarding the issue of, in facing China. So that's what, and then Chinese government is cleverly deploying divide and rule strategy. And for European Union, you need all the 28 countries to have consensus. Now they're picking several countries on their side, and there cannot be a consensus, and there cannot be one foreign policy towards China. So I hope there is a debate going on, and some think tanks have come out with reports, some politicians are speaking about China, but general consensus is not yet there, and general awareness is also not yet there.
So what should the Europeans do?
And I always say, to have a consensus is very difficult. to deal with China, bilateral approach is
So what
not
should
going
the
to
Germans do? They don't need consensus, they are the strongest and the largest. What should Angela Merkel do?
form multilateral approach. So that's how you go. You get any number of countries, use United Nations Forum, international forum, and speak for human rights and democracy in all the international forum, and get 10, 12, 15 countries speak together. That way, China cannot pick individually and weaken you or destroy you. But as long as there's multilateral front, that's the way to go.
And in terms of economy, because this goes, the narratives are different. Donald Trump is waging war against China. By the way, I wish him success as a European, as a Czech, for counterbalancing China. But this is very much like a unilateral move, very much anti-liberal trade order, which we have been embracing here also in Central Europe for the last 25 years. So he has chosen this track, as now the Europeans are more for still keeping the liberal order in the economic sense like intact for the trade and investment, but this does not go together with united Western front, how to somehow contain China. What should we do there? What should the discussion be there? And should we wish luck to Donald Trump?
I think one can have a contrarian view. And is there any particular country which actually follow liberal economic policy and liberal trade policies? Every country has its own, protection of certain sectors of business. So one can say Trump approach is anti-liberal economic policy, but what is the alternative?
Or free trade, let's say international free trade.
But what is the alternative, You can't just criticize someone and not have an alternative approach. Europe doesn't have one. So Trump's argument is the Chinese approach is very, illiberal trade approach, trade business, so that has not benefited America. Now they're correcting the system, right? That's all they're saying. Now, you can always criticize Trump approach, but you have to have an alternative. Unless you have an alternative, you cannot say you're wrong, but there's no other approach. Then China will win again.
Well, the European Union and the US should be on the same page because they have the same complaints about China. They both want WTO, World Trade Organization reform. And the Europeans being very good at fence-sitting, they have a trilateral with the US, Japan, and Europe on one side for WTO reform, and the Europeans and China in another camp. So they're trying to reform, help the Chinese save face, but at the end of the day, the Europeans have the same complaints. The European Chamber of Commerce book of complaints is just as thick as the American Chamber of Commerce complaints. And it's European businesses complaining to leaders to do something about this because they're open for business, but it's almost impossible for them now to really make money in China, to bring their money out of China, to take their data away. And they're forced to put like a Chinese Communist Party official inside their companies. So all these things changed, all these rules changed once Xi Jinping came to power. And I think they're a bit unhappy about that.
But the fact is that the European trade deficit or Germany's trade deficit with China is completely different than what is the US. Do you think that Trump will be successful in at least balancing the trade deficit with China? Which would equalize it more with the Europeans, then we could perhaps be on more the same page than what we are now?
I think most economists don't worry about deficits. It's only Peter Navarro who somehow graduated from Harvard. I don't understand why he has this obsession with trade deficits.
I like our surpluses,
But I think, China was allowed into the World Trade Organization, and everyone thought, with this wishful thinking, that they would transform. And now we see them play the system, and they're actually they might be the reason that the WTO is destroyed, and this would be an awful event. So by having them enter this organization, they've actually weakened it, and we see dumping and all these problems that, especially with technology, the WTO doesn't address these issues. So I think that does need reform, and the EU and US are working together now to work on reform. So we'll see how China actually responds.
The US House just passed a Tibet Reciprocal Access Act, which essentially means Chinese diplomats and journalists and scholars, they come to America and they have free access to America. But similarly, American citizens and diplomats and journalists and students and scholars are denied access to Tibet. So the idea being that if this bill is passed in the Senate and the Trump signs it, it becomes a law. That if Chinese students and scholars, like Theresa, they want to come to America, they're welcome to do so, but similar access should be given to Tibet. If that kind of bill be considered, even in the European Parliament, in European countries, that's one thing to consider. Because at the moment, getting visa for scholars to go to China is a reward given by the Chinese government for your well behavior. For journalists also is a reward. So that's why, that kind of bill might also help.
Just one quick comment. I think it's important, I mean, the soft power that we all talk about, it's good to have Chinese students come and study and see other systems and have access to the internet. So I know there's some moves within the US to kind of cut down on that, but I think at the end of the day, there is, Xi Jinping won't last forever, and we have to think about the future and the next generation. And I can't imagine that this system can, it could implode. And we see that China spends more money controlling their people, Wei Wen, than they spend on defense, and they spend an awful lot on defense. So they have a lot of internal challenges.
Good that you brought it up, because we have spoken about liberal values, democracy, human rights, which is probably rather deteriorating these days in China. We've spoken about economy and the economic power, but we haven't touched the military power. And then there China invests heavily and has certain ambitions, maybe not globally now, but at least the regional ambitions there are. How much we should be really worried about the Chinese military power, Chinese military might?
I don't think China is restricted to region per se. They have extended all the way to Africa, and they want to have presence in various parts of Asia, and also, if possible, eventually in Europe as well, and Caribbean island as well. I think their goal is global, and they want to be number one, not just economically, but politically with their own ideology and system, and militarily as well. So that's why, as I said from the very beginning, the choice is very clear. You either transform China or China transform you. So they want to dominate the world.
As I said earlier, Europeans are comfortable thinking China is so far away, but 2 years ago we saw a naval exercise from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Last summer we saw Russia-China naval exercise in the Baltic Sea, and with live ammunition shot near Kaliningrad. So it's not so far away anymore. China's first overseas base is in Djibouti, which is right here in Europe's neighborhood. We've seen debt-trap diplomacy create possible bases. Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which is in India's neighborhood, so the Indo-Pacific, they had so much debt that they had to hand over the port to the Chinese for 99 years. So it's kind of like what happened to Hong Kong under the British. But many analysts suspect that that will be a base. Gwadar in Pakistan will be a base. So this string of pearls, I mean, China's lining up everything possibly for future. So we have to, stay alert. We can't just think it's all unicorns and rainbows. But I think, the Chinese are positioning themselves, even with the polar route. We see investments all along that region. And what is the relationship between Russia and China? I mean, this part of the world's very familiar with Russia, but they work together. So how does that, how will that play out?
Should we hug Russians? Should we hug Russians and talk to them about China or not?
Should you heart Russians?
Hug. Should we embrace Russians? Should we talk to Russians about China? Frighten them that Siberia is getting lost? Or we have more problems in Europe here with Russia, that we are not capable of such maneuver?
Well, that was another form of wishful thinking. I think many thought that inevitably the Russian and China relationship would just pull apart because Russia is playing junior partner to China, and that it's inevitable. But it's actually, they're an interesting partnership because China has the deep pockets. Russia has a lot of experience in other areas. We see Russians actually training Chinese. They're on the ground in Syria. They have lots of experience. So China will eventually overshadow them, but they still can learn a lot from Russia and get some technology still.
I know, because of proximity, Europe sees Russia as a bigger threat, but in actuality, China is a bigger threat because they have more capacity. So Russia can only extend so much, but China can extend all over the world, and politically they are doing so. Political interference in Australia is well known, New Zealand, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Even President Trump is saying they are interfering in the upcoming election in America. So the Russian interference in politics or election of America pales in comparison as per the assessment. So there, China's interference in European politics is also becoming more and more clear. And what they have used in Tibet is co-optation of ruling elite, top leaders and ministers. You see in many countries coming, and you see even in Europe, they are co-opting leaders, essentially buying their service or convince them to support China. So that's very sinister and that's very dangerous.
And the Chinese strategic thinking is never to go to war. That's admitting failure. Because for the Chinese, it's to win without fighting. And they're opting for what we call preemptive obedience in Europe, to get countries to say yes, yes, yes. And some have described it as the anaconda in the chandelier, so that you don't know when the snake's going to come down and get you, so you just kind of watch it and walk around it carefully. So the Chinese, from their own strategic thinking, they don't like war. That's kind of a failure. So by creating these bases, by investing or creating the impression of economic leverage, they can actually get, and buy off elites, elite capture. We see a lot of that in Europe. Various European leaders are in China's camp.
Charles.
Tomáš, thank you. I'd like to thank Forum 2000 for making this possible again for the 22nd year. I'd like to thank our guests also for your expertise. And I'd like to thank Tomáš for opening the envelope concerning the political military force projection capabilities of China in the context of One Belt, One Road. We need to remember that for some 20 years, China has been investing in warehouse centers in Poland. It has been largely promises in many respects, but also promises sometimes fulfilled. And yet, the question we need to go back and look at is China really operating in a non-aggressive long-term mode? And I would suggest that the development of a deep-water navy, the work with Russia to open an Arctic passage, the fact that, for example, the Indian Ocean port, which you mentioned, thank you, has been dredged to a much deeper depth than would be necessary for the types of container ships that would park there, that would dock there. Keeping in mind the idea of Piraeus and everything that the Chinese are now buying up, what is the answer?
Yeah, regarding One Belt, One Road, as far as Tibetans are concerned, we lost our country because of one road. The Communist Party of China came to Tibet promising us prosperity if only we build a highway connecting China to Tibet. And we helped them build that road. Once the road was completed, trucks came, guns came, tanks came. It's been 60 years we are occupied. So the One Belt, One Road, when we hear that, it reminds us of that one road which led us to loss of our country. And recently, there was a song put up in praise of One Belt, One Road, sang by many of the country, many of the 670 countries, they're singing. And that song was direct copy of a Coca-Cola ad 20 years ago, except the word Coca-Cola was taken and replaced One Belt, One Road. Why I said this is Tibetans also compose a song praising Chinese government for bringing the road from China to Tibet, and we lost our country. So One Belt, One Road is coming to Europe. Whether you lose your country or sovereignty or not,
we have last remaining minute. We have last remaining minute. Oh. So it's basically for your last comments of answers. I have two questions. One is Donald Trump going to be successful against China regarding the trade issue? And the other is where we will be with China and where China will be in 10 years from now. What will be the trajectory in your crystal balls?
Okay, when I arrived last night, I arrived at the airport, Václav Havel Airport. The first thing I saw was a giant poster, Bank of China for renminbi offshoring. And then right next to it was a huge ad for Xi Jinping's newest book. Then I arrived at my hotel, turned on the TV, and RT, Russia Today, had a documentary on the Silk Road, and I just felt like, oh my gosh, it's futile, it's futile to resist. I felt like I was inundated with all of this China, 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 and I think a lot of it's perception. The Chinese are very good at advertising what they've done, and so there's this kind of growing perception that they're so powerful, what are we going to do? In regards to, every country has to be prepared for the future, and we haven't seen this before. We haven't seen, for example, the three things that the Europeans have decided after their annual meeting at the first week of September was Africa, where they've really been missing in action, and China has really grabbed the opportunities there, multilateralism, and the Balkans. Now, we're used to Russia operating in the Balkans, but we've never had China operating in the Balkans. Now we have this corroding effect of China and Russia interference or influence activities in this region. So this is something we've never seen before. And I think we really have to start waking up and not see China as we would like it to be, or as a way to hedge against Brussels to signal that you're unhappy, but really see it for what it is and move forward together and value. The last comment I want to add, since this is all about democracy and values, China has changed, Europe more than Europe has changed China. I can think of several examples, but I'll just leave you with this thought. Cambridge University Press, the oldest and most well-regarded journal in the world, was willing to censor in order to get into the Chinese market. So 1.4 billion people is really whetting everyone's appetite. And they think, well, I can compromise on my values because I want to make money. I want to be in that market. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, do we have these values as liberal democracies, or are we willing to compromise?
So, is Donald Trump going to win, yes or no?
I was told never make predictions, and if you do, make them often. So Donald Trump has definitely he's changed everyone. Okay, many people in the U.S. don't think he has a strategy, but I spoke to Xi Jinping, and it was a public forum, so I can quote him. He said, he is a Machiavelli, and I've never seen such a brilliant strategist in my life. So he's an advisor to Xi Jinping. So the Chinese really see Donald Trump as a massive strategist, and they see him doing one thing at a time and focusing, and the Chinese are very worried. So he's got China's attention.
Now, given the aggressiveness of Chinese mindset and the expansionist design, you need a pushback. So whether one like it or not, Donald Trump is pushing back. Now, you can have all the views and reservation about it, unless you have an effective alternative. That's the only strategy that's on the table. So, we would like to see a pushback. Number two, now as far as, Chinese people are concerned, we must agree that they also want basic freedom. They also want democracy. They also want human rights. They also want environmental rights. So Chinese people are like any other human being who would like to see democracy in China. So it's government versus people. Finally, as a Tibetan, I would say what happened to Tibet 60 years should not happen to Europe and European people. So what happened to us could happen to you. In a way, it's already happening. Chinese government is already here. So it's for you to choose whether you want to be like Tibet and Tibetan people or not. I hope not.
Is China going to be more democratic or less democratic, as it is non-democratic now, but from today and in 10 years?
No. Xi Jinping has already said socialism is Chinese characteristic, no democracy. That's the strategy the Chinese leaders have. Now, China should be democratic, and Chinese people want to see China democratic. So hopefully, that democracy will prevail again, and we will have the fourth wave of democracy.
Last word?
Okay. Modern technology has never been used to such great effect by authoritarian regimes. We've seen Xinjiang as a laboratory of what our future could look like. And it's dystopic, and I'm very concerned. I think in the past, we always thought, the people's will always, you cannot keep an authoritarian regime forever. They have 70-year lifespans, and then the people revolt. But under an authoritarian regime with such incredible technology where they create the reality, they censor the outside world, and they control the internet and all the other information they have, this is something we should be very concerned about.
And they're exporting the same software to authoritarian countries around the world. So it's not just in Tibet or Xinjiang, inside China. They're exporting the rest of the world. That's what we should be aware of. Our
30 minutes are over. I do thank you very much. Thanks for participating, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Later.